All right. All right. Charles Moskowitz here. Thanks for joining me, everyone. Alan Bokhari is my guest this segment. He is a journalist, investigative journalist with Breitbart News. Um, Alam, you have been covering the issue of censorship in the social networks. It's getting much worse by the month, by the minute, it seems, as more and more of our friends and anyone who expresses a conservative opinion is being deplatformed, is being depersoned in a way. What's going on? What is your research telling you?
That's absolutely correct. We've over the past 10 years, we've just handed over the entire digital public square, which was meant to be this, free, open place for the free and open exchange of ideas, to a handful of completely unaccountable far left Silicon Valley companies, Google, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. And these companies all have the same values, and they're now implementing censorship on the basis of those values. And I talk to people in Silicon Valley, people who work for these companies, for Facebook, for Google, and companies like that, and they all tell me the same thing, that after 2016, after the election, there was just a huge atmosphere of shock in Silicon Valley that Donald Trump was able to be elected. And there was a sense that they didn't do enough to stop it from happening, that they didn't censor enough right wingers. And I think ever since 2016, we've been seeing them trying to correct that, kicking off every major right wing figure you can think of from these platforms. And now in the past few months, censoring Donald Trump himself, censoring the president's accounts. So Twitter has censored his posts by hiding them behind messages. Snapchat censored him, saying they won't give him a featured status like other big accounts. Twitch TV, which is a streaming platform owned by Amazon, banned his account completely over alleged hate speech last week. So it's definitely intensifying, and we've still got 5 months to go until the election. So I think we're going to be seeing a lot more censorship of of not just the president's biggest supporters, but the president himself.
I mean, I was not surprised to see conservative opinion censored, but I did not think they'd go as far as censoring the president of the United States. I mean, that's almost like a coup d'etat. That's what revolutionaries do when they storm the radio station and they take over a city. This is like the Bogotazo in 1958 in Colombia when Castro and Che Guevara took over in Bogota and Castro seized the radio station and delivered a 3 hour speech. This is really, really unacceptable that this could happen. Um, you have your research shows you that there's a small coterie of left wingers who are just on the top of the heap in terms of Google, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and all the people that I'm grateful are carrying this show. But I've been told by people who know how this works that I've been shadow banned and that my show would be much bigger now had that not been the case. So, I'm just maybe I should just be lucky they allow me on at all. And maybe at some point I'll wake up one day and turn it on and find out that I no longer am on. And that probably will happen. I'm trying to take measures to prevent it, but what can you do?
Well, I mean, yeah, YouTube has certainly purged a lot of conservative accounts, a lot of right-wing accounts, and we've shown that we've released exclusive material from within Google showing that YouTube has search blacklists for political topics. So on searches like abortion, the Federal Reserve, various other political topics, David Hogg, Maxine Waters, they've actually added all these search terms to a file called controversial query blacklist. And when they add search terms to that file, what it does is it promotes so-called verified YouTube accounts that are seen as authoritative and trustworthy by Google. And what that basically means is the mainstream media, the left-wing media, maybe one or two token conservative news shows like Fox, but it completely crushes independent channels like yourself. And when we released that evidence of that blacklist, I believe it was back in late 2018, early 2019, there were thousands and thousands of entries on it. So this is something that YouTube absolutely does, and definitely every independent producer should be worried about it.
And that even includes Breitbart, which I understand has lost a pretty good percentage of its following since the 2016 election. Um, as a libertarian, and you list yourself on Twitter as a libertarian, as am I. Um, what can we do in terms of answering this usual claim that these are private companies? They have a right to censor whatever they want to censor, and if we don't like it, we can start our own Twitter.
Well, I think libertarianism doesn't involve supporting massive monopolies and concentrations of power, especially when those are propped up with assistance from the government. So all of these Silicon Valley companies, they don't operate in a free market. They owe their position to special privileges that the federal government gave, that the Congress gave them in the 1990s. One specific law in particular called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. That's the
Mm-hmm.
law that prevents them from being sued for content they host on their platform. So if a user posts content that violates the law somehow or defames someone, then you're allowed to sue the user, but you're not allowed to sue the platform that carries it. And that seems like a common sense thing to do, common sense law to apply to a platform, because you don't necessarily sue the newsstand if the New York Times defames you, right? So that's the
Right.
argument there. The problem is these Silicon Valley companies are now not behaving like neutral newsstands that just carry newspapers. They're behaving like the newspapers themselves. They're editing content, they're prioritizing certain types of content, they're behaving like publishers, and you are allowed to sue publishers for content. So this law that's allowed them to that allows their business model to exist, the argument is that should be predicated on actually behaving like neutral platforms and not like publishers. And I certainly agree with that.
So then they've been proven to be publishers by censoring opinion. But they make the argument that they have these very vague community standards, which I think they redefine every so often and very arbitrarily, and that are there to prevent, as Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes famously said, fire in a crowded theater. In other words, you have freedom of speech, but you cannot incite violence. And I agree with that to an extent. I mean, I wish they'd take off some of these, Black Lives Matter posts that do encourage violence, especially against black businesses, which they are looting and burning and killing black people. But it shows their bias. But maybe if they did that across the board and objectively somehow, then yeah, I mean, there is a certain level maybe that could be a threshold that might be crossed. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about legitimate free speech discussions on important issues that might be controversial, but isn't controversy what free speech is all about?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's so many Antifa accounts on all of these platforms. Meanwhile, they're banning conservatives just for posting facts. I think it was Andy No who was banned, who was locked out of Twitter last year just for stating facts about crime rates against trans people. Meanwhile, Antifa are allowed to openly advocate violence and terrorism on these platforms. Antifa has been described as a terrorist movement by the Attorney General, by the President of the United States, and yet Silicon Valley just completely ignores that and continues to allow them to operate on their platforms. There really needs to be a way for people to just quantify the way that these terms of service are unevenly applied. Like Sarah Jeong's, do you remember the Sarah Jeong story? This New York Times reporter who
Mm-hmm.
went on tirades against white peoples, comparing them to dogs pissing on fire hydrants, all sorts of extremely obscene racial hate speech. And not only did Twitter not ask her to delete the tweets, but they gave her a verified checkmark. So I'd love to see some conservative think tank keep a running list, keep a catalog of all these instances, because there are thousands and thousands. This is a gigantic research task. The problem, of course, is that conservative think tanks and much of the conservative establishment are in the pocket of these tech companies. One of the things I explain in my upcoming book is that the conservative movement has in part been co-opted by Google and Facebook. They've been flooding DC with money, and that includes leading conservative institutions like the Heritage Foundation, like the ACU, the AEI, the CEI, all of these, big name think tanks. So this is really an issue where ordinary Republicans, the ordinary grassroots, need to hold their lawmakers and their representatives to account and make sure they don't just take Silicon Valley's money and ignore the problem.
So they're taking Silicon Valley's money, the big Googles and the giants, which are the wealthiest combines in the country and in the world right now. And at the same time, those same giants are holding them into a subtle condition of blackmail in that if you don't play ball, then you're going to be banned. There's this sort of, access to media, the means of communication, which is the definition of socialism, is a basic right. That we have to. It's like would they ban people's telephone conversations? It's a basic right, and when they have 95% of the market, it is a monopoly. It is de facto government because they have literally formed a government, even though they're not elected to anything, and they're deciding and they're arbitrating on who is heard, who isn't, how they're heard. They've come up with this communist idea of hate speech, which is something that they practice in communist China, and they put people in prison. It's a political crime. That's something that is un-American. In the United States, we're supposed to have due process, and if you're convicted of a crime, it's because of actions, not thought. You can use hate speech. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but it's something that could be used as a vehicle to prove a crime in a lawsuit, or but in of itself, it is not a crime, even if it's despicable and even if we condemn it. And they have criminalized speech.
Yeah, and the Supreme Court has ruled that hate speech does not apply in the United States. It's superseded by the First Amendment. Yeah, what amazes me really, you mentioned a right to access these platforms. I agree with that. What amazes me is the sheer double standards compared to other industries. So if a landlord kicks you out of your apartment for spurious reasons, it could be a tiny, crappy apartment, but you'll still have a right to due process to challenge that in court. And in many cases, the landlord would need to go through a court first to get the eviction order. It amazes me that Silicon Valley companies that sometimes are critical to the survival of businesses or politicians or even whole political movements, there's no similar due process for the people who use the platforms. Your entire business could be dependent on YouTube, it could be dependent on Facebook or Google, and yet if they bury you in search results or if they arbitrarily kick you off for whatever reason, you can't take them to court, you can't sue them, and that just strikes me as completely unsustainable, and there definitely needs to be a serious new regulation brought in.
And yet the media, the mockingbird media, because of their diabolical and deranged hatred for Donald Trump, are celebrating the censorship. I mean, I'm seeing them here in Boston, where I am, on WGBH. They have the Roundtable Media Talk. Oh, they're so thrilled that Facebook is being put under pressure to censor the president because they don't like what he's saying. They don't like his opinions. And unfortunately, the ADL is behind a lot of this. And I'm speaking here as a Jew, so it's not a matter of anti Semitism. But they support every left wing cause coming down the pike. And they're big on the issue of banning quote unquote hate speech, which I wish they would ban certain things that are hate speech. But no, it's anything that doesn't genuflect to the left is hate speech. Anything they say it is, they decide what constitutes hate speech. And it is tyranny. It is absolute authoritarian tyranny.
That's why these new terms like hate speech are such, or extremism they're now using as well, are such a problem, because the left love these words because they can just stretch them to cover all of their political opponents. Yeah. And sadly, the organizations that used to be seen as authorities on actual, hatred and racism, like the ADL, have now been totally co-opted by the left. They're essentially clones of the Southern Poverty Law Center and these other far left groups that exist to just smear conservatives and smear right-wingers as somehow hateful for expressing certain political opinions. And the Silicon Valley companies are just completely towing the line on that. And when they don't, as we see in Facebook, they'll get boycotted by by these new woke corporations that are now also have these far left activists in their boardrooms and are also being pressured by these far left organizations. So
And
Facebook,
shaken down for a lot of money too, I might add.
so I mean, Facebook has censored all sorts of prominent right-wing people over the last few years, censored Laura Loomer, Paul Joseph Watson, many others. But that's not good enough for the left. So now there's this huge ad boycott against Facebook from some of their major advertisers, spurred on by the media, spurred on by these far left groups, trying to force them to censor even more right-wing and conservative content ahead of the election. Of course, they call it hate speech, but what they mean is right-wingers and conservatives.
And it's going to get real ugly if President Trump starts to win and starts to pick up, and he probably is. And it's going to just be the nastiest thing you've ever seen. Now, in communist China, they now have complete control over the cyberspace, and Google has completely capitulated there in order to have access to China. And the result is that they've agreed in China to engage in this technology of social scores. So, therefore, a Chinese citizen gets a social score depending upon how much fealty they offer to the regime and how politically correct they are. And if they have a low social score, which means that they might have spoken out about something, that can hurt them in every sense. It could hurt their employment. It could hurt their ability to go from point A to point B. It can hurt their ability to have a marriage. I mean, it's a complete control. Do you think that that's going to come here?
Oh, I think it's already here, and
Yeah.
I think it's just in the hands of private corporations, but that doesn't make it any less scary because they're all governed by the same uniform political ideology, all of these Silicon Valley companies. So every one of these Silicon Valley companies, almost everyone, will give you a certain score based on the quality of your content. And quality used to be defined as, are you a spam bot? Are you posting unsafe links to phishing websites? That might lower your quality score. Those are fairly objective reasons why you might be suppressed or shadow banned or whatever. Shadow banning was originally brought in just to stop spam bots. No one disagreed with that. But now the quality score is being expanded to cover things like hate speech and extremism and all of these political concepts. And again, every single company will assign a hidden score to their user: Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, even Uber. Your score is well known to you, your review score, but there'll be a hidden score as well that they won't tell you about. Every one of these platforms, and if it drops low enough, if you're politically blacklisted, then you're going to be people have, I mentioned Laura Loomer, she abandoned Uber and Lyft, so you can lose access to transportation. You can lose access to even PayPal and Venmo, the means to do business over the internet, as well as the ability to speak over the internet on these public square platforms.
You become a non-person, in other words. Alam, you are coming out with a book that could be a stick of dynamite in the face of all of this. It's going to be very interesting to watch how that goes, how well you are received, and how much you receive in terms of airtime and interviews. But you're one of these guys that's stepping up to the plate and taking a swing, and I applaud your courage. I hope that you do well. I hope that others are inspired by your example, because the only way to combat this thing is by creating a critical mass of awareness amongst the rest of us, so that we can be more prominent about it in every way we can. I mean, there are still media that's available. We still have print. We still have the old-fashioned subscriber lists. I mean, ultimately, I think they're going to fail, because ultimately freedom prevails and ultimately truth gets out. But the only question really is, how bad is it going to get before it gets better? So, where can people go to read your excellent articles and find out information about your book?
Well, first of all, thank you for all those words. I certainly think this is one of the biggest issues Americans are going to face over the next half decade or decade: the power of these unaccountable tech giants. So much more powerful, I think, than even the industrial barons in the late 19th century and the monopolists back then, because they didn't have such power over the flow of information. If you want to read my material, you can find me on Breitbart News. Just search for Alam Bakari. And if you want to pre-order my book, it's out in September. Just go on Amazon and search for #deleted big tech's battle to erase the Trump movement and steal the election.
Excellent. And I hope to have you back periodically. So, Alan Belkari, thank you for joining me this afternoon.
Thank you, Charles. Great to be here.
All right. Take care.